Wyoming Territory, July 1883. The sky was red with smoke when Rowan Riggins lost everything. The fire started just after noon. A lightning strike cracked across the high plains and hit dry grass behind his barn. By the time Rowan saw the smoke, the blaze was already racing toward the house. He got the horses out. He tried to save the barn, but the wind tore through like the devil's breath, and within the hour his ranch was ash and ruin. He stood barefoot in the blackened dirt, shirt sleeves scorched, breathing hard. The house he built with his father. The barn he raised with neighbors. The tack, the feed, the fencing, the tools. Gone. He had a few singed dollars in his pocket, a horse that limped, and nobody to tell him what to do next. No wife. No kin. Just the silence that comes after fire. 2 days later, Rowan rode into the town of Bitter Creek with soot in his hair and pain in his bones. Sheriff Colburn gave him a cot in the jail's back room and a plate of stew. "You can stay a spell," the sheriff muttered, not asking questions. Rowan did not sleep much that night. The ranch had been his life. It was all he knew. But something deeper gnawed at him. He had not just lost buildings. He had lost the only place that had ever felt like home. By morning, word was spreading. Folks came by, offering half-hearted condolences and pointing him toward odd jobs. Rowan nodded, but his heart was not in it. He needed more than a chore and a roof. He needed a reason to start over. That reason came 3 days later when he heard shouting from the train station. He stepped out into the sun, squinting toward the platform. The noon train from Cheyenne had just arrived, steam hissing and cattle lowing in the stock cars. But the shouting was not about cattle. A girl stood at the edge of the platform, clinging to a carpet bag, her face pale under the sunbonnet. Sheriff Colburn stood near her, arms crossed, jaw tight. "I told you there is no one here for you," the sheriff said. "You were sent under false pretenses. The man who paid for your passage is not coming back. He died 4 weeks ago." The girl's voice cracked. "But he was going to marry me. I came all this way. You were his third attempt at a mail-order bride," the sheriff said, voice hard. "First one ran off. Second one turned around before she even got here. You are not the first woman he tried to trick into coming out here. You are just the first one who arrived too late." The girl's hands shook on her bag. "What am I supposed to do?" Sheriff Colburn shook his head. "There is no room at the boarding house, and no one around here is taking in strangers. Not after what happened last year." Rowan stepped forward before he could think about it. "I will take her," the sheriff blinked. "You sure about that, Riggins? You do not even have a roof over your head." "I have land," Rowan said, "and a tent, and 2 hands that work." "That is more than she has right now." The girl lifted her face then, and Rowan saw her clearly for the first time. She was young, but not a child, maybe 20. Her eyes were dark blue, rimmed with red from crying. Her dress was plain and travel-worn, but her chin was lifted, steady. "I am Noelle Nash," she said, voice quiet but sure. "And I do not need charity. I will work. I can cook and sew. I know how to keep chickens. I will earn my keep." Rowan nodded once. "Fair enough." The sheriff stared between them, then sighed. "All right. But you two had better keep your heads down. Last thing this town needs is another scandal." Rowan led Noelle to the livery stable where he had tied up his horse. She followed without complaint, holding her bag close. He helped her onto the saddle and walked alongside, leading the horse back out toward the remains of the ranch. They reached the edge of his land by dusk. The air smelled like char and dust. Noelle climbed down and looked around at the blackened field, her lips parting. "This was your home?" she asked. He nodded. "It burned 4 days ago," he said. "I saved the water pump and a couple of tools. There is a canvas tent by the creek. It is not much." "I have slept in worse," she said. That night they sat by a small fire, sharing dry bread and boiled beans. Noelle wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stared into the flames. Rowan worked on carving a new handle for his shovel. After a while, she said, "He told me he had a little farm. Chickens, goats, a garden. He said he was lonely, that he just wanted someone to sit with him at supper." Rowan looked up. "Why did you come?" Noelle's hands tightened in her lap. "Because I had nowhere else to go. My sister's husband put me out after she died, said I was a burden. I thought maybe I could be useful to someone." "You did not expect to be welcomed like this." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "I did not expect to be turned away like a stray dog either." Rowan leaned back, the firelight casting shadows along his jaw. "You are not a dog. And you are not a burden." Noelle met his gaze, and for a moment something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but the spark of two people who had both been scorched by life and still stood. "You can stay," he said. "As long as you need." She nodded. "Thank you." They turned back toward the fire, silent again, but the quiet between them was not cold. It was the kind of silence that let things grow. The cold came early that year. By mid-August, the nights along the creek turned sharp, and breath hung in the air before sunrise. Rowan rose before dawn each morning, shoulders stiff from sleeping on hard ground, and worked until light rimmed the far hills. Noelle was up not long after, hauling water, gathering fallen branches for the fire, keeping her hands busy in a way that told him she was used to earning her keep. They spoke little those first days, just enough to pass tools or ask after the weather. But the quiet wasn't strained, more like two people learning each other's rhythm. One afternoon, Rowan returned from a day spent salvaging boards from the far corner of the property, where an old chicken coop had half collapsed. He found Noelle kneeling by the creek, scrubbing something against a rock. She looked up when she heard his boots and brushed hair from her cheek with the back of her hand. "I found a patch of wild mint," she said, "near where the cottonwoods start. Thought it might keep the water tasting less like iron." He crouched beside her, dipping his fingers in the current. "That's so?" She nodded, then added, "There's also burdock growing near it. I know how to boil the root. My mother used to make a tonic for the cough." Rowan watched her for a moment. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow and her hands were red from the cold water, but her movements were steady, sure. He hadn't known what she'd bring with her when he took her in, but it hadn't occurred to him it might be knowledge he didn't have. "You ever worked land before?" he asked. "Not land like this," she said, rinsing a cloth. "But I lived with my aunt in Indiana before my sister married. She kept a garden and sold preserves. I helped where I could." He sat back on his heels. "You think you'd know how to plant again if I cleared a patch near the old corral?" She glanced his way, considering. "If the roots weren't scorched too deep and if we can keep the deer out." "Maybe." He nodded once. "I'll start digging tomorrow." That night the wind picked up, whispering through the burned-out fence posts. Rowan added a second log to the fire and noticed Noelle holding her hands close to the flames, her knuckles raw from the scrubbing. "You don't have to do everything," he said. "This isn't yours to fix." She looked at him then, the firelight touching her face. "I'm not fixing it, I'm living it. That's different." He didn't answer at first. He watched the flames and thought of all the days he'd spent building something he thought would last, only to have it vanish in a single afternoon. Noelle hadn't come to rebuild what was gone. She was starting something new in the same place. "You miss Indiana?" he asked after a while. "I miss quiet mornings with coffee on the stove," she said, "and the smell of cut hay in summer, but I don't miss feeling like someone else's problem." Rowan leaned back on his elbows. "You're not a problem." She gave a small smile, soft but not uncertain. "Not anymore." The next morning, Noelle knelt in the dirt near the old corral, sleeves rolled and hair braided tight. She used a stick to draw lines in the soil, marking rows with quiet focus. Rowan stood nearby, watching the way her fingers pressed into charred earth, coaxing something useful from land that had gone still. He brought her a bucket of water from the creek, and she took it with a murmured thanks. As she poured a little into each row, he caught the scent of mint on her skin. "Where'd you learn that trick with the rows?" he asked. "My aunt had a system," she said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Said straight lines made hope easier to count." He looked down at the rows of dark soil lined up like stitches in a wound. "Seems about right," he said. That evening, she roasted the last of the potatoes she traded for with a woman in town, withered but serviceable, and tore a bit of cloth to wrap her feet beneath her boots. Rowan noticed, but didn't mention it. Instead, he laid out a plank of wood and began measuring for a frame. "You plan to build something?" she asked. "2 cots," he said. "Off the ground. Might sleep better that way." Noel nodded, then added, "Maybe I can trade for canvas. I've seen feed sacks stitched together to make something close." Rowan glanced at her, watching the way she folded her hands when she wasn't sure what to say. "You're good at making do," he said. Her eyes met his and held. "I've had practice." He nodded slowly. "Me too." They left it there. The next day, Rowan rode into Bitter Creek with a short list of lumber and a coil of wire he hoped to trade. When he returned, he found Noelle kneeling beside a small fire, her face drawn, eyes fixed on a figure sitting across from her. It was a boy, no more than 12, with a torn coat and blood on his lip. Rowan dismounted fast, hand brushing the handle of his knife. "He's not trouble," Noelle said quickly. "He came from the East Road, says he's alone." The boy looked up, wary but not panicked. "I didn't steal nothing. I just needed a place to stop." Rowan studied him a long moment. Dust clung to the boy's boots. His hands were cut from bramble. He wasn't lying. "You got a name, Illy," the boy said. "Illy Harper. My ma died last winter. I've been walking since spring." Rowan exhaled slowly. "You hungry?" Illy nodded once. Rowan turned to Noelle. "Can you spare enough for 3?" She was already ladling stew into the pot. That night they ate in silence, the boy chewing fast, Noelle watching with quiet worry, Rowan thinking about things he hadn't thought about in years. About what it meant to have someone look to you. About the cost of letting someone stay and the cost of sending them away. After Illy fell asleep curled beneath a borrowed coat, Noelle leaned close. "We can't keep him," she said softly, "but we can give him a place to rest a while." Rowan nodded. "That's enough for now." She glanced at him then, not with fear or doubt, but a kind of steady recognition. Like she saw in him the same thing he saw in her, someone who hadn't planned on starting over, but was doing it anyway, and doing it together. Illy stayed 3 nights before saying he meant to keep moving west. He didn't offer more, and Rowan didn't press him. Noelle packed a parcel of food wrapped in muslin and handed the boy a wool scarf she'd cut from an old petticoat. Rowan walked him to the edge of the property and watched until the boy's figure vanished into the low hills. The quiet that followed held a different shape. By late August, the sky softened with gold in the evenings. Rowan had begun framing a shelter, 4 upright posts and a roof pitched low. He worked without hurrying, every board lifted by hand, every joint notched and set with care. Noelle spent her days gathering seed from drying wildflowers and stitching feed sacks into curtains. One afternoon, she knelt by the corner of the shelter, piecing together a square of oilcloth. Rowan paused with the hammer in his hand. "You sewing something for the door?" he asked. "No," she said, threading the needle. "It's a ground cloth. If we're going to have a table, it ought to sit even." He nodded, then wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. "You think we'll have a table soon, if you build it," she said, glancing up. "I'll cook something worth setting on it." That made him smile, but only faintly. He set the hammer down and sat on the edge of the frame, watching her fingers move through the cloth. You always know what to do with your hands. She folded the cloth once, checking the seam. Idle hands make fast regrets. My aunt used to say that. He reached for a tin of nails beside him. Your aunt sounds like someone who knew how to live through lean years. She did, Noel said. But she didn't know how to be kind without keeping score. There was always a cost. Rowan turned the nail between his fingers. Was that why you didn't stay with her? She thought hardship made debtors of everyone, she said softly. I didn't want to live like I owed her for every meal. He was quiet for a long time, then said, I don't keep score either. She looked up at him then, long enough that her needle paused mid-stitch. I know, she said. By September, the garden rose had sprouted thin green shoots. Noel watered them morning and evening, boots sinking into the soft soil. Rowan scavenged more timber from the far edge of the property and began building a lean-to for tools. He didn't say it aloud, but he was starting to think of the place not as something ruined, but as something beginning again. One morning, just after sunrise, Noel stood at the creek's edge, sleeves rolled, her hair loose down her back. Rowan approached with an empty bucket but stopped when he saw her. She turned, startled but not embarrassed. I didn't hear you come up. I wasn't trying to be quiet. She dipped the tin pail into the water. There's a heron that comes just after dawn, stands still as stone, waiting on fish. I think he's smarter than most men. Rowan raised a brow. That's so, she handed him the full bucket. He waits. Doesn't swing first just to see if something's there. That's more sense than most people I've met. He took the pail. You think I swing first? No, she said, stepping back onto the bank. I think you wait longer than most would, even when it hurts. He didn't answer right away. You ever think about leaving here? He asked finally. She looked toward the hills. Not since the first night. Why? She met his eyes. Because I never felt safer than I do right now. They didn't speak the rest of the walk back. But he set the bucket down a little closer to her, then kneaded and left his gloves on the table where she sat sewing. That evening, they sat beneath the new roof, the sun dropping behind the far ridge. Rowan had made a bench from a split plank and Noel leaned against it, knees pulled up beneath her skirt. The air smelled of dust and green things. I've been thinking, he said, voice low. Once the shelter's done, we could board up a corner for sleeping. It won't be big, but it'll keep the wind out. She nodded, then asked, You plan to sleep in there too, if that's all right with you? She was quiet a long time before she said, I'd like that. He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but something shifted between them like a gate swung open. Later that night, as the fire burned low, she reached out and laid her hand over his. Not bold, not shy, just certain. He turned his palm up and held her fingers there, his calluses brushing the delicate bones of her hand. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. By the third week of September, a steady rhythm had settled over Rowan's land, one not dictated by loss, but by the quiet forward motion of two people building something side by side. Rowan had nearly finished the door for the sleeping room. It was rough pine, planed by hand, held together with wooden pegs he'd carved himself. The hinges came from the old barn, the only pieces he'd been able to save from the fire. When he lifted the door into place, Noel stood back, wiping her hands on her apron. I never thought I'd see a home come together in pieces, she said, but this feels like it's meant to last. Rowan stepped back, testing the swing of the door. It's not much. It's honest, she said. And it's ours. That evening, she brought in a bundle wrapped in brown cloth and unrolled it on the new shelf he'd built for her, a row of glass jars, each filled with dried herbs, seeds, and a few pieces of flint. I traded for them with a woman whose husband hauls freight. Said she'd rather have help with her laundry than keep these gathering dust. Rowan picked up one of the jars, studying the tight weave of the lid. You planning to start your own apothecary? Noel smiled softly, but there was no jest in her voice. "I want to be ready next time someone needs more than shelter." He set the jar down carefully. "You think there'll be a next time? There always is." They sat by the fire that night, not speaking much, the sound of crickets rising from the brush. Rowan shifted closer, his shoulder brushing hers. She didn't move away. "Did you ever think you'd end up out here?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I think I was meant to." "Why?" She reached down, picking a pebble from the dirt and turning it in her fingers. "Because out here I'm not just surviving. I'm becoming someone I recognize." Rowan looked toward the dark slope of the hills. "You think I am too?" "I think you already have," she said. "You just haven't noticed yet." Rowan rose before dawn the next morning and found Noelle already outside, kneeling beside the small garden. There'd been a light frost, and she was covering the young shoots with burlap sacks. "You always up this early?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Only when I care about what happens next." He crouched beside her, helping to pin the sacks with stones. "I've been thinking," he said. "About winter." She paused, watching his face. "I can ride into town before the snow sets in. Pick up flour, beans, salt. We'll need candles, maybe more wool." Noelle folded the last sack over the smallest row. "I can trade for more cloth. And I'd like to sew a quilt before the real cold comes." Rowan brushed dirt from his hands. "You'd make it by hand?" "I'd stitch it from what we have. Old shirts, flour sacks. Every piece would mean something." He nodded slowly. "I'd like that." She stood, brushing her skirt. "And I'd like to sleep inside, come winter, not just under the roof, but in that room with you." Rowan looked at her, and the weight of what she said settled deep and quiet. "You sure?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." He didn't reach for her then, didn't need to. They stood in the pale light, breath rising in the cold, and something between them solidified without needing to be spoken again. By the last week of the month, the garden had gone still. Rowan harvested what they could: small turnips, a handful of beans, a few squash. Noelle lined shelves with glass jars and hung dried herbs from the rafters. One evening she handed him a folded square of cloth. "What's this?" "A shirt," she said. "Stitched from the last bolt I had. You've worn that same one since the fire." Rowan unfolded it, fingers tracing the seams. The fabric wasn't new, but her stitches were steady, and the collar had been lined with soft flannel. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Just wear it when the wind turns." He looked at her then, really looked. Her eyes didn't carry the grief they had when she stepped off that train. They held something steadier now, something like belonging. That night they sat close inside the room he'd built, the door closed against the wind. Rowan lit a stub of candle, the flame flickering against the wall. Noelle lay beside him on the cot, her hand tucked beneath his. "You think we'll make it through the winter?" he asked. She turned toward him, her breath warm against his collarbone. "I think we already made it through the fire." He kissed her then, quiet, sure, and without rush. It wasn't first love. It was something forged, something tested. The kind that didn't need promise to be lasting. The kind that stayed. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Inside, they lay together, not as strangers, not as two broken souls patched together by need, but as something whole, something chosen. The fire had taken everything, but in its ash, something new had taken root, something that would not burn. By the first frost of October, the roof no longer leaked. The hearth was laid with river stones, and the room that once only served to hold out the cold now held warmth that settled into the bones. Rowan had built the chimney with his own hands. Brick by brick from clay and sand he hauled up from the low creek bend. Smoke curled now from the flue, steady and clean, curling into the pale sky above the shelter. Inside, Noelle was bent over her sewing frame, piecing together the early strips of her quilt. The bits of worn flannel and faded muslin were stitched in a pattern she hadn't seen since girlhood. A simple star, surrounded by squares, each one cut from their days here. Rowan wiped his hands on a cloth as he stepped through the door, the smell of dried apple and wood smoke clinging to his coat. "I traded for a hand auger," he said, setting the tool near the wall. "The kind with a good bit. Should hold through fence post holes come spring." Noel looked up, her eyes catching the firelight. "That'll make the work easier." He nodded, then knelt beside the stove to warm his fingers. Colburn said the last train from Cheyenne brought in a new schoolteacher. Young fellow. "He's boarding with the preacher's widow." Noel set her needle aside. "That'll be the first school this town's had in years. Sheriff said they're fixing to use the abandoned assay office till something better's built." She leaned back, stretching the quilt edge across her lap. "You think children will come, if they can make the ride?" She smoothed the edge of a square. "If I'd had a school like that, just a dry room and someone to read to us, I might have found my way sooner." Rowan looked at her, brow furrowed. "You found your way just fine." She held his gaze, then reached for his hand. "With help." They didn't speak more on it. The fire crackled and the wind pulled dry leaves across the doorframe. The next morning she walked with him to the far fence. They had cleared nearly half the field of char, and seed catalogs from the freight office in Rawlins were tucked in a drawer, waiting for the thaw. Rowan measured out the line for a new split rail corner, while Noel counted the nails. "You ever think about what this place will look like in 5 years?" she asked. "I think about what it'll sound like," he said. "Wind moving quiet through wheat, chickens clucking in the dust, maybe a child laughing near the porch." Noel's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You want children, if they come," he said. "If you wanted them too." She nodded slowly. "I think I do, not out of duty, but because something in me's settling for the first time." They finished laying the corner rails and walked back, boots crunching over frost-laced grass. That night, she made a stew from dried beans and the last of the cured venison. Rowan carved a second spoon, dipping it in beeswax to seal the grain. Later they lay in the cot, her head tucked beneath his chin. He traced the bridge of her fingers with his thumb. "Do you miss anything?" he asked. She was quiet for a time, then said, "Only the parts of me that didn't know this could exist." They did not speak after that. The night folded around them soft and sure. As winter deepened, Rowan rode to town less. Noel made candles from tallow and dipped them by hand, hanging the strings from a length of twine stretched between 2 beams. She read aloud from the only book they had, a collection of sermons and fables she'd carried from Indiana. Rowan listened while he carved handles for their drawers. One snowbound evening, she unwrapped a small parcel she'd hidden in the bottom of her trunk. Inside was a piece of lace, delicate and yellowed with time. "My mother's," she said, laying it flat across the quilt. "I've been saving it." Rowan looked from the lace to her face. "For what?" "For when I stopped living like I might vanish." He reached for her hand. "You're not going anywhere, I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He didn't need her to finish. He stood, pulled his coat from its hook, and went to the drawer where he'd kept a small velvet pouch since the day he'd cleared the ashes of the barn. Inside was a ring, plain, gold, and once his mother's. He brought it to her without words. She took it with both hands, eyes filling. "Will you marry me, Noel?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. They married in early December. Sheriff Colburn stood as witness, and the preacher's widow hosted a small supper of biscuits and cider in her parlor. Noel wore a dress made from undyed muslin, and the lace from her mother's parcel was stitched into the collar. That night, they returned to the homestead as husband and wife. The snow fell soft outside, and inside the hearth glowed steady. Rowan lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the back of it. "You're my home," he said. "And you're mine," she whispered. They lay together beneath the quilt she'd stitched, the stars overhead muffled by the snow clouds, warm in the shelter they'd built with their own hands and hearts. Come spring, the garden bloomed. Noel planted rows of cabbage, carrots, and beans. Rowan built a hen house and chicks arrived by freight. They added a second room to the cabin and hung the first photograph they ever took together in a frame above the hearth. By the third summer, a cradle sat in the corner, carved by Rowan and painted by Noel. Their son was born on a morning when the sky was clear and the wind smelled like cut grass. They named him Elias, after the boy who once passed through and reminded them what it meant to offer rest. They never left the land. Through storms and lean seasons, they remained steadfast, rooted and whole. And every night before the fire dimmed, Rowan would reach for her hand and she'd lace her fingers with his, the silence between them always full of peace.